The jungle had defeated the rules of modern warfare, until a lone engineer decided to rewrite them with a welding torch. It was March 14th, 1943. On the unforgiving Solomon Islands, specifically Guadalcanal, the morning light pressed down like a physical weight, slow, oppressive, and utterly relentless. The atmosphere was so suffocatingly warm that bare metal tools felt instantly searing to the touch, and soldiers often found themselves reduced to pale imitations of their former stamina. Deep within the vast jungle canopy, a green world so thick it seemed to absorb all ambient noise, a solitary earth mover sat inert. Its substantial blade was partially entombed in a thick, black volcanic sludge that had the tenacity of pitch. The machine's engine emitted soft clicking sounds as its metal parts began to cool down. Surrounding this silent behemoth, roughly 100 troops waited, observing a young officer, Lieutenant Wesley Crawford, as he restlessly measured the ground in front of the vehicle. His heavy boots made a squelching sound in the dense mire. He carried no firearm, only a simple wrench, yet his expression conveyed an intense determination the hostile environment had failed to break, a profound dissatisfaction with the limits of current capability. The U.S. military had deployed to the Pacific Theater with a clear objective: that the sheer output of American manufacturing strength would guarantee their passage to victory. They had promised that infrastructure would materialize from pure wilderness, that landing strips would appear almost instantaneously, as if summoned by a modern form of industrial magic. But the jungle possessed no regard for human promises. It had resisted Spanish invaders centuries prior, completely swallowed countless exploratory missions, and now it formed an immovable barrier between the Allied forces and their planned northern push toward rebel. The Japanese forces maintained control of the elevated positions. They efficiently managed the lines supplying their troops. And for every rotation of the clock the American troops spent struggling in the mud, it granted the Imperial forces another precious opportunity to entrench themselves deeper, strengthen their defenses, and prolong the conflict. The official estimate declared that a useful access road could be carved through the 30 miles of jungle territory, but it would require 6 excruciating weeks. This was 6 weeks that senior commanders simply could not afford to sacrifice. 6 weeks that would impose a casualty count measured not merely in groups of 10, but in escalating hundreds. The tracked vehicles they had been issued were considered marvels of industrial construction from Detroit. These Caterpillar D7s, each machine tipping the scales at more than 20,000 pounds, were undoubtedly capable of rearranging topography, provided they were allocated sufficient time. But time was the sole commodity that no one had the means to create more of. The machines advanced at a depressing pace, barely 2 miles per hour on relatively solid ground, and less than 1 mile per hour across terrain like this. They became hopelessly mired in the unstable volcanic soil. Their heavy treads spun uselessly in the sticky mire. Their wide blades, optimized for the flat farmlands of Iowa and the typical job sites in California, scraped futilely against root systems as thick as a man's chest and ancient trees that had stood fast for centuries. The engineers had been assured that American ingenuity would overcome any obstacle presented, that the sprawling factories back in the homeland had meticulously anticipated every possible challenge. They were told their equipment represented the cutting edge of global technology, and factually, it was. Yet, the jungle environment preceded any industrial plant, and it followed an entirely separate set of rules. Lieutenant Crawford had arrived in the Pacific holding the same conviction as every newly commissioned officer: that success in this conflict would be achieved by rigorously following standard procedure, by executing every command with impeccable precision, and by implicitly trusting that the original designers of the equipment held superior knowledge to the men operating it in the field. He had devoted his initial 4 weeks on Guadalcanal to strictly adhering to this belief. He operated his bulldozer exactly as outlined in the technical manual. He performed maintenance procedures according to military regulations. He diligently prepared reports documenting that forward momentum was slower than anticipated and formally requested additional heavy machinery. The extra equipment never materialized. The reports vanished into an administrative abyss, where bureaucratic paperwork went to perish, and the jungle continued its undefeated streak. But a fundamental change had occurred within Crawford during his second month of duty. Perhaps it was the morning he observed a reconnaissance team return to base, carrying 3 grievously wounded men on stretchers. Men who had been ambushed on a narrow path that should have been a functioning road by that point. Perhaps it was the sleepless evening he spent listening to the heavy, distant thudding of Japanese artillery, fully understanding that if the vital supply corridors remained unsecured, the entire operation would grind to a halt, leaving those enemy guns free rein to pulverize American fortifications into dust. Maybe it was simply that he had grown utterly weary of being consistently beaten by the mud. What fueled his choice? Wesley Crawford made a decision that, under different circumstances, would have undoubtedly resulted in severe disciplinary action, even a court-martial. He ceased following the written doctrine. He initiated his analysis by examining the apparatus itself, approaching it not as a soldier assesses a mandated weapon, but as a skilled artisan examines a tool that is fundamentally ill-suited for the demanding task at hand. The D7's frontal blade was broad and horizontally oriented, ideal for dispersing excavated dirt across level surfaces, but completely ineffective for severing root networks that formed subterranean barriers denser than cured concrete. The engine possessed abundant horsepower, but the transmission system carefully managed that energy, optimized for extended operational life rather than immediate, overpowering strength. The extensive tracks distributed the vehicle's immense weight evenly, which prevented immediate sinking in soft material. But this also negated the aggressive purchase required to violently tear through the dense jungle floor. Every engineering feature that made the bulldozer outstanding for peacetime construction projects rendered it merely adequate for the brutal demands of jungle warfare. And in this theater, being merely adequate was synonymous with being dangerously insufficient. Could an individual engineer truly redefine the terms of engagement? Crawford devoted his off hours to sketching radical changes in a notebook soaked by humidity, using the weak glow of a kerosene lamp. He systematically consulted with the mechanics, seasoned specialists who understood machinery with the devotion of clergy studying holy texts. He sought counsel from the Seabees, the naval construction battalions who had been inventing solutions on the fly since their initial beach landings. And gradually, a conceptual design began to solidify. It was not refined, it was utterly unsanctioned, and it was certainly nothing that would ever feature in an Army Corps of Engineers publication. But it represented something that might actually deliver results. He resolved to structurally transform the bulldozer into a machine it was never intended to be. He would convert a device designed for deliberate creation into a powerful instrument engineered to violently eliminate everything in its trajectory. The initial structural modifications commenced on a Saturday morning, a time Crawford was officially scheduled for rest. He and 6 committed volunteers, 3 engine mechanics, 2 certified welders, and 1 Seabee named Kowalski, who boldly asserted he could construct anything using scrap metal and sheer resentment, descended upon the stationary D7 like surgical teams preparing an unresponsive patient for radical intervention. They detached the standard blade assembly and replaced it with a fearsome component they fabricated from repurposed ship hull plating. They also utilized robust steel teeth scavenged from excavator buckets found in a heavily damaged Japanese fortification nearby. The resulting blade was significantly slimmer, remarkably sharper, and angled acutely, like the front edge of an icebreaker ship. Its function was not to push earth, but to methodically slice through it. They fortified the primary cutting edge with high-carbon steel previously utilized as part of a destroyer's protective armor. When the work was complete, this new blade possessed the capability to cleave a tree trunk measuring 3 feet across without significantly reducing the vehicle's momentum. But this radical blade replacement was only the first step. They disassembled the engine's transmission housing and intentionally bypassed the speed governor that automatically restricted the engine's RPMs, a modification that instantly invalidated every potential manufacturer's warranty and violated every known safety protocol, but which granted the earth mover immediate access to its absolute maximum power output. The engine, initially calibrated to operate at a prudent 1,800 revolutions per minute, could now audibly shriek up toward 2,400. The extraordinary internal strain would inevitably cause its destruction eventually, but eventually was a logistical problem for a future date. Right now, the imperative was speed. They welded extra layers of steel plating around the vulnerable radiator and the main engine block, not primarily for defense against enemy small arms fire, though it offered that benefit secondarily, but to safeguard against the massive branches and flying debris the machine would now be violently shattering rather than merely deflecting. They affixed a second, independent set of high-intensity headlamps mounted securely on a reinforced roll bar, lights potent enough to effectively transform the darkest night into the brightness of midday. Because if this entire scheme proved successful, Crawford fully intended to operate the vehicle 24 hours a day without cease. The single most profound structural change was applied last. They completely removed the standard factory exhaust apparatus and substituted straight discharge pipes that vented the engine's tremendous roar directly out into the surrounding jungle. The resulting noise would be ear-splitting, unnaturally harsh, the mechanized shriek of an utterly alien creature that belonged in no natural ecosystem. The Japanese soldiers concealing themselves in the dense foliage would undoubtedly hear the customized machine approaching from miles away. But Crawford deliberately relied on that psychological impact. He wanted them to hear it clearly. He desired for them to lie awake during the late hours, listening to the horrifying sound of American industrial capacity grinding its relentless path directly toward them, as unstoppable as a slow-moving flood and as certain as the rising sun. Terror, he had quickly observed, functioned as a potent weapon, just as effective as any sharpened blade. Necessity is the parent of radical invention. When they finally stepped back, the machine resembled something conceived and assembled by a maniacal genius. The newly configured blade protruded menacingly, resembling a massive ramrod. The heavy armor plating provided it with the unmistakable profile of an armored tank. The unbaffled straight pipes made it sound like a mythological dragon in its death throes. One of the exhausted mechanics stepped back a pace, wiped the oil and sweat from his hands onto a discarded cloth, and voiced the collective apprehension. "Sir, if this absolute monster doesn't immediately kill all of us, it just might be effective." Crawford offered no trace of smile. He simply climbed up into the operator's position, ignited the engine, and felt the entire rigid frame begin to shudder with suppressed, barely controlled aggression. The bypass governor immediately unleashed the engine's complete fury. The auditory output was nothing short of apocalyptic. Native birds erupted from the canopy in panicked flocks. Soldiers instinctively covered their ears against the blast. And Lieutenant Wesley Crawford, 26 years old, holding an academic degree in civil engineering from Penn State, and fundamentally unqualified to be a wartime technological innovator, felt for the first time since setting foot on this desolate island that he possessed a genuine chance to succeed. The crucial field test commenced at 0600 hours the very next morning. Crawford had not taken the time to secure formal approval. He had not submitted an official operational report. He simply aimed his bizarre, cobbled-together bulldozer at a specific sector of the wilderness that had successfully resisted 2 entire weeks of traditional clearing efforts, and he lowered the custom blade into the soil. The engine screamed at its limit. The massive tracks bit aggressively into the earth, and the primeval jungle, which had stood largely undisturbed for thousands of years, began its rapid demise. The blade violently impacted the initial tree, a massive ironwood giant that would have demanded an hour of back-breaking labor with an axe to fell, and sliced clean through it effortlessly, like a heated knife cutting softened butter. The tree collapsed heavily. The bulldozer failed to hesitate. It struck the second trunk, the third, the 10th. Root systems that had intertwined underground for centuries were immediately severed with the sound of snapping guitar strings. The unstable volcanic soil that had proven stubbornly impossible to shift was suddenly being flung out behind the machine in soaring tails of dark muck. Crawford made no attempt to navigate around obstacles. The massive tracks bit aggressively into the earth, and the primeval jungle, which had stood largely undisturbed for thousands of years, began its rapid demise. The blade violently impacted the initial tree, a massive ironwood giant that would have demanded an hour of back-breaking labor with an axe to fell, and sliced clean through it effortlessly, like a heated knife cutting softened butter. The tree collapsed heavily. The bulldozer failed to hesitate. It struck the second trunk, the 3rd, the 10th. Root systems that had intertwined underground for centuries were immediately severed with the sound of snapping guitar strings. The unstable volcanic soil that had proven stubbornly impossible to shift was suddenly being flung out behind the machine in soaring tails of dark muck. Crawford made no attempt to navigate around obstacles. He drove directly through them, and in his violent wake, where only moments before there had been an impenetrable expanse of raw wilderness, there now existed a clearly defined thoroughfare. The soldiers who witnessed this event would later struggle immensely to find accurate words to describe it. Some compared the experience to watching a substantial dam rupture, the same overwhelming sensation of unstoppable natural force, of a natural world reluctantly submitting to a power greater than its own. Others resorted to using heavy biblical metaphor, discussing mountains being hurled into the sea or deep valleys being suddenly raised up. But the interpretation most frequently offered was simpler and more truthful. It was like observing the absolute future arrive far ahead of schedule. Every assumption they had carried about waging war in the jungle, about the terrain being as effective a killer as any enemy soldier, about the Pacific being a hopeless burial ground for American strategic goals, all of it was being instantly invalidated in real time by a junior lieutenant who had personally determined that the established regulations no longer possessed any meaningful validity. By the stroke of noon, Crawford had successfully carved out 3 full miles of road through terrain that had been projected to require a minimum of 7 days. By the time the sun set, he had extended the distance to 5 miles. He operated the modified bulldozer in carefully managed shifts, passing control to his trained operators while he maintained supervisory duties, constantly adjusting settings and fine-tuning the machine's performance. They quickly discovered that the customized blade functioned most effectively when held at a specific, slight upward incline, and that the engine could sustain its maximum RPMs for approximately 45 minutes before requiring a cooling period. They also noted that the straight exhaust pipes required clearing of heavy carbon buildup approximately every 6 hours of operation. They acquired knowledge through direct experience, through minor failures, and through constant adaptation, and the functional road continued to lengthen. News of this unprecedented success spread throughout the division like a rapidly moving brush fire. Field officers arrived specifically to observe the operation. Engineers captured detailed photographs. The skeptics who had previously dismissed Crawford as a reckless and untutored amateur stood completely speechless as the previously impossible quickly became a matter of routine execution. By the close of the 3rd full day, the heavily modified bulldozer had achieved what the operational projections claimed would demand 6 weeks of continuous effort. 30 miles of road, decidedly rough but fully passable, sufficiently wide for military supply trucks and troop transporters, had been forcefully cut through jungle that had never before encountered a wheeled vehicle. The critical supply corridors that had been constantly constrained were suddenly flowing efficiently. Heavy artillery that had been immobilized in the rear staging areas was now rolling rapidly toward the forward positions. The entire tactical advance, which had been dangerously stalling for weeks, abruptly lurched back into aggressive motion. And central to this revolutionary success was a machine that possessed no official authorization to exist, operated by a dedicated man who had consciously decided that official operational restrictions were nothing more than optional suggestions. But the narrative does not conclude with the mere construction of a road, because what Crawford had ultimately created was not just a temporary tactical fix, but a profound shift in operational philosophy. The standard issue bulldozer represented the established American belief in technical perfection, the naive conviction that if a device were designed flawlessly on the first attempt, it would perform optimally in every conceivable environment. Crawford's specific modification embodied a radically different viewpoint, the conviction that rapid adaptation held more value than abstract perfection, that sharp ingenuity demonstrated in the theater of operations could easily eclipse theoretical planning done in a sterile laboratory, and that the personnel directly facing the specific difficulties were frequently better equipped to devise solutions than the administrators who had never once left the drawing room. This concept, that governing procedures could be instantly rewritten by anyone dedicated enough to pick up a wrench and think outside the established parameters was a deeply American idea, and it frightened the high-ranking generals almost as intensely as it successfully impressed them. What were the long-term implications of such necessary rebellion? The official organizational reaction proved complex and contradictory. On one front, Crawford's daring innovation had achieved undeniable results that simply could not be ignored or wished away. On the other, he had flagrantly violated numerous operational protocols, fundamentally altered government property without explicit authorization, and created a machine that was, by any realistic safety assessment, a disaster waiting to materialize. There were immediate internal discussions concerning initiating court-martial proceedings. Urgent memoranda were circulated emphasizing the absolute necessity of preserving proper military chains of command. Yet, there were also frantic requests pouring in from other sector commanders across the region. Men who had learned about the road-building miracle and demanded their own customized bulldozers immediately. Practical necessity ultimately triumphed. Crawford was swiftly promoted to the rank of captain and formally assigned the duty of instructing other field engineers in his unconventional methods. The modifications he developed were systematically standardized, refined for mass production, meticulously documented, and quickly spread throughout the entirety of the Pacific Theater. Wherever American forces desperately needed to gain ground faster than the jungle environment could possibly resist, Crawford's unique earth movers soon appeared. Unattractive, incredibly loud, exceptionally effective, and virtually unstoppable. The Japanese combatants who initially heard those machines approaching learned to fear them in ways they never feared standard American infantry or traditional artillery. Infantry units could be flanked and ambushed. Artillery bombardments could be anticipated and evaded. But these bulldozers were fundamentally different. They symbolized a concept that possessed no parallel in established Japanese military doctrine. The notion that logistics itself could be deliberately weaponized, that the mere creation of roads could be instruments of total conquest, and that the raw American ability to simply construct faster and transport more supplies would ultimately prove more consequential than individual courage or even tactical brilliance. Surviving captured journals from Japanese defenders found in the Solomons, Burma, and the Philippines mention the demon machines that operated ceaselessly, day and night, machines that could not be deterred by challenging terrain, inclement weather, or acts of sabotage. They seemed to embody a terrifying, underlying truth about the adversary they faced. Americans fundamentally refused to accept limitations. They simply engineered their way past them. One particular diary entry recovered from a Japanese officer slain during the Battle of Bougainville recounts hearing Crawford's specialized bulldozers operating nonstop throughout the night. We can hear them constantly now, even when they are many kilometers distant. The grating sound transmits through the very earth beneath us, a methodical grinding noise that never ceases. Our senior officers assure us that we must hold this sector, that the jungle will defend us, just as it always has done. But the jungle is visibly shrinking. With every passing morning, the terrible sound draws closer. With every sunrise, more trees are felled. We were repeatedly told that Americans are inherently weak, that they cannot endure sustained hardship, and that their complex machinery would surely fail in the untamed wilderness. But these machines do not fail. They do not exhibit exhaustion. And I am beginning to believe that we severely underestimated not their sheer material power, but their unwavering institutional refusal to accept any form of setback. They are not engaging the jungle in a fight. They are methodically erasing it. And when the forest cover is entirely gone, we will possess nowhere left to conceal ourselves. This observation revealed the true psychological component of Crawford's remarkable innovation, the aspect that resisted quantification in terms of cleared mileage or transported tonnage. It was the crushing realization, spreading among the enemy ranks like a slow-acting toxin, that the United States military held not merely overwhelming material advantage, but something far more strategically lethal, an internal, institutional license to rapidly improvise, to discard what proved ineffective, and to instantly construct something superior right where they stood. Japanese forces were rigidly trained to execute predefined plans with absolute, unforgiving fidelity. American forces, conversely, were trained to achieve specific operational objectives by employing any means deemed necessary. And in a massive conflict fought across innumerable remote islands, dense jungles, and colossal logistical distances where the standard textbook solutions rarely proved applicable, that fundamental difference was utterly decisive. The bulldozer itself ascended to the status of a potent symbol, prominently featured in morale-boosting newsreels distributed back on the home front, where it was proudly showcased as undeniable evidence of American ingenuity and national tenacity. However, those newsreels, with their rousing narration and highly cinematic musical score, unfortunately overlooked the profound underlying truth. What truly elevated Crawford's modifications beyond mere engineering brilliance was not the cleverness of the changes. Many competent engineers could have conceptualized similar adjustments given sufficient leisure and resources. What made it historically significant was Crawford's ability, or his decisive seizure of the authority, to execute the plan immediately, without waiting for slow approval from some distant, anonymous administrative board. In this critical sense, the heavily modified bulldozer served as a perfect, working articulation of the American military operating at its peak efficiency, decentralized decision-making, intensely pragmatic, and willing to permit a low-ranking lieutenant armed with a good conceptual idea to dramatically alter the trajectory of an entire campaign. Following the conclusion of the war, Crawford returned to his home state of Pennsylvania and resumed his professional life as a civil engineer. He devoted his skills to designing modern bridges and major interstate highways, overseeing large-scale construction projects, and living a predictable, quiet existence that bore little resemblance to his chaotic months in the Pacific. He rarely, if ever, discussed his famed bulldozer. When questioned about it directly, he would typically dismiss the inquiry with a simple shrug, insisting he had merely done what the immediate situation demanded, and that any reasonably competent engineer would have arrived at the identical solution, that he had benefited from luck far more than genuine cleverness. This response may have stemmed from profound humility, sincere honesty, or a complex blend of both. But the men who serve alongside him preserved a very different memory of the events. They remembered a man who confronted an insurmountable problem and resolutely refused to accept that impossibility represented a final verdict. They remembered a specialized machine that roared like the apocalypse and operated with the efficiency of divine intervention. They remembered functional roads materializing where only trackless jungle had been. And they remembered learning, in the most visceral and immediate way imaginable, that the war would ultimately be won not by the faction possessing the most sophisticated and pre-planned strategies, but by the side demonstrating the capacity to discard those strategies fastest when the brutal facts of reality demanded a change. Adaptation matters more than planning. There exists a specific photograph, captured sometime in the late stages of 1943, that powerfully encapsulates the profound essence of this entire story. It displays Crawford's custom-built bulldozer at temporary rest, carefully parked adjacent to a newly established road that stretches into the hazy distance, unswervingly straight as a drawn arrow, bordered by the jagged stumps of colossal trees that had proudly stood for centuries until they met specialized American steel. The reinforced blade is heavily caked with thick, dried mud. The welded armor plating bears several noticeable indentations from impacts no one had taken the time to log. And in the background, barely discernible, is a lengthy motorcade of crucial supply, trucks rolling steadily toward the forward combat zone. Their secure passage was made possible entirely by a lieutenant who had decided his required vehicle was moving too slowly, and that passively waiting for the bureaucracy to produce a solution was an unacceptable option. This specific picture is not widely known. It does not appear frequently in the definitive histories of the Second World War, but it absolutely merits recognition because it memorializes a fundamental truth often overlooked in the meticulous accounts of grand naval battles, sweeping global strategies, and great leaders making historically significant decisions. Conflicts are frequently decided in the operational margins, by the individuals who flatly refuse to accept that the assigned tools they have been given are sufficient, who recognize the profound disparity between the current state and the required state, and choose to forcefully construct a solution across that divide using their own initiative. Even if, or perhaps especially if, no one has granted them formal authorization. The physical road Crawford's team pioneered is long gone today, inevitably reabsorbed by the aggressive jungle environment decades ago, buried beneath successive new growth that has erased nearly all physical evidence of the violence that once carved through that space. But the powerful underlying idea persists. It finds expression in every combat engineer who modifies standardized equipment in the theater of conflict, in every military unit that discovers a demonstrably better method to accomplish its primary mission than the method outlined in official doctrine, in every modern military organization that intentionally fosters a culture of trust, empowering its personnel to actively engage in problem-solving rather than simply complying with commands. It resides in the core realization that the most devastating weapon any nation can deploy is not a complex machine, but a culture that strategically empowers its lowest-ranking members to examine profound challenges and perceive immediate possibilities rather than imposing rigid restrictions. The issued bulldozer proved too sluggish, so they radically increased its speed. The native jungle was overwhelmingly dense, so they ruthlessly cut through it. The overall conflict was impossibly immense, so they chose to fight it one significant innovation at a time, one crucial improvisation at a time, one previously impossible assignment at a time, until the impossible task became predictable routine, and the enemy realized too late that they were not confronting mere soldiers, or powerful tanks, or swift naval vessels, but something far more strategically dangerous, an entire national identity built upon the unshakable conviction that every operational difficulty possesses a viable solution, and that anyone possessing nothing more than a simple wrench and a powerful idea has the unquestionable right to go looking for it. If you appreciate stories of overlooked heroes and industrial innovation in wartime, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the Battlefields for more deep dives into history's turning points.